So now it's time for panel two. That'll discuss the advanced air mobility market operationalization, and what are the catalysts that'll make it happen. Now, I'll be moderating this session. So we're going to have, like the previous session that Rudy did, we've got 3 collaborative pairs, right? So we're looking at this from a collaboration perspective. First pair is going to look at investments and market development. So we've got Andrew Giton and Charlie Hipwood. And then we've got a second one that'll be discussing integrated airspace with Dr. Heather Arneson and myself. And the third one will be expanding into adjacent opportunities. So that's kind of going to be kind of interesting. And I'll talk about why. The approach we're going to do is, I think we're going to go through all 6 of these presentations, and then we'll open up to questions. And as before, you can send your questions to me in the chat function. And we'll get going. So let me start by, let me introduce Andrew Giton, who serves as the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Collins Aerospace, now part of Raytheon Technologies. So Andrew will remark on how the industry looks to invest in the industry and its time frame for return on investment. So Andrew, are you on?
I am.
You are? And if you're ready to go, do you have any slides, or you?
No slides for me. I'll just some talking points around kind of observations and how we're assessing,
okay,
kind of what we're looking for to assess this market as we see it evolve over time. So
fantastic.
All right. Well, good. Well, thanks, Wasim, and thank you also to AUVSINE New England for hosting the event and inviting me to speak. As Wasim indicated, this panel is focused not really just on the ultimate size of this market, which certainly at Collins, under the right conditions, we believe could be certainly interesting, but also very, possibly very large. But really more practically, the timing, right? And that the timing of it is one of the things that will drive the level of investment beyond this initial phase that we've seen the last couple of years. In particular, in certainly drone investments are going for a long time, but the broader urban air mobility ecosystem as well. And so when we think about timing, we also kind of think about when is it going to become sustainable, kind of get past its initial startup phase, but then also when does it really start to scale? And what are some of the key factors that we look at impacting its growth there? And so as Wasim mentioned in his introduction, I work on our strategy organization at Collins, which means I have the fun job of trying to use a crystal ball and what other tools and tricks we have in the trade to predict all of this to our leadership with enough confidence that we can kind of allocate the right amount of investment at really the right time, right? To sort of in accordance with our overall strategy and business objectives. As I said a little earlier, when we look at the market, we certainly have no doubt that this market is going to launch and become new and sustainable segment of the global transportation sector. But really to gauge that ultimate size and timing and really what's the rationalization or justification for the tremendous amount of investment that's been going primarily into vehicle development here the last 2 or 3 years, we really focused our attention on 3 substantive factors, which I'll call both vehicles and vehicle technology. The infrastructure side, which has been a lot of the focus, I think, of some of the discussion of the first panel, both the physical infrastructure as well as the digital side of that infrastructure, as well as the regulatory standards environment around each of these. I mean, if you've attended other AAM forums, you've heard other folks talk about how this sector of aviation is trying to kind of accomplish in 10 years what it took almost 100 years of the current aviation sector to achieve. And certainly the advancements in technology are going to get us there, but it's going to take a lot of all of these other factors aligning as well. And so when we step back, fundamentally we think there'll be these 3 stages before we can really declare this market in our mind at sort of this full scale or maturity at whatever point you want to call that. I'd say we're really in the midst of this first period right now, this initial launch period, where we think the objective of most of the participants is largely to prove out the aircraft technology, the vehicle technology, particularly in eVTOL, as they scale up from drones or scale down, depending on how your perspective, right, from business jets or helicopters into these markets, and that's solving critical problems around distributed electric propulsion and fly-by-wire, ultimately with a goal of demonstrating the benefits of the technology and the lack of negative impacts on their environments in relatively controlled operations. Meaning they have to really prove out the noise, the safety, the operating costs, right, at some level of operation, or deliver what's been promised. And then we believe once that's achieved, the second stage is really going to be a growth to this early scale and sustainability, where this segment becomes, self-sustaining on its ability to generate income in its value chain and kind of allocate that profit across the value chain, that kind of all stakeholders continue to participate. We think that's really going to be evidenced when we see a second wave of new entrants, or really probably a set of vehicle redesigns by first movers. We sort of anticipate that happening as well, that are incorporating lessons learned from the first phase. One of which we think is going to really, what needs to happen is a rationalization to some extent of the wide variety in vehicle designs we see today, right? That where the vehicle design and the use case align a little bit better, and you kind of get a design that emerges, which I think will help actually then leverage the technology investment better, because it won't have to be adapted so much across vehicle design to vehicle design. That's an important factor, I think, as we think about, when does something become a one-off technology product and really convert to a scalable product line. The third, and I was encouraged to hear about some of this in the first conversation, and the alignment, I think, is there on what needs to happen. This transition to full scale and maturity, which is something that's going to be ultimately enabled by wider infrastructure deployment. So figuring out these hard problems of how are the airspace services and the vehicles going to coexist with existing airspace and operations. But then importantly, from a technology standpoint, then the ability to really rely on automation and autonomy in both vehicles and airspace in a full-scale operational context and operational benefit, not just as an enhancement to safety, but really what enables you to deploy tens of thousands of these vehicles globally. And so we stand back and look at these factors today and where they need to go in the next 2 or 3 years. Definitely very encouraged by the progress. But still see a few challenges. On the vehicles, smaller eVTOL drones, particularly those used for inspection, surveillance, even small package delivery, have made tremendous progress technically, and the new regulations folks were just talking about that are going to enable BVLOS operations are really on a good path. Really, it's getting to the point of taking these, and I think someone mentioned it earlier too, also from technology and development activities to true operational demonstrations and operations in real environments, really not so much to prove out the technology, but prove out that the business scales and the economic benefits we all believe are there can be captured by the stakeholders that are going to be involved. And larger eVTOLs for urban air mobility or larger cargo operations, I mean, that's really been much of the excitement the past 2 years. Lots of attention to these platforms. Frankly, I think in some cases on the verge of being almost overhyped. Too many people potentially to survive, but I think that's natural in any market like this with this much opportunity that's out there. But with that amount of money being raised and the progress in the technologies particularly around batteries and distributed electric propulsion, they really do now seem viable. I think Colonel Diller spoke about that earlier, and AFWERX stepping in and doing what it's doing to help the industry is critical to that. And so we see them as viable today. But again, over the next 2 years, the eVTOLs in particular, need to prove out the benefits of noise, operations, reliability, prove they really are a better vehicle design for this type of operation and can do something light helicopters just simply haven't been able to do, and do it at scale. They don't really have to be fully autonomous to do this in this early stage. We think that can and likely will become later, mainly because so many of the autonomous capabilities, when you apply to that use case, raise much longer cycle kind of regulatory issues, and likely consumer acceptance issues as well. I think from an infrastructure standpoint, It's really the area we're monitoring probably most closely right now. JJ showed a nice, from Raytheon RIS, showed a nice video of how ourselves and RIS are collaborating now in terms of how we look at next generation airspace across the spectrum of opportunities. It's certainly less mature, but what we've really seen in the last few months, starting to see the kinds of regional activities, both not just academic research activities or test sites, but really economic development consortia coming together in places like Vancouver, Ohio, Los Angeles, Paris, Seoul, globally. Because really what's necessary there is to really develop that overall economic business case. Again, that I spoke back to that kind of value chain that has to be created for all stakeholders. And that stakeholders aren't just the private capitals and the venture capitalists putting money into vehicles. It's the cities and the states and the municipalities that also need to dedicate resources to developing the environment. And so we're starting to see those groups come together and start doing the right things in terms of economic development studies and really trying to measure the impact and assemble the right set of stakeholders. What we're hopeful to see is a few of those, it doesn't have to be done everywhere at the same time, but a handful of really leading regions step out. And I think someone said earlier, just do it, right? Let's put things together, that public-private partnership approach where you can get some relief to some of the regulatory constructs that exist and really begin demonstrating this works beyond just a technology experimentation. And I think that gives the rest of the market the confidence to come in and begin investing more in that part of the value chain. And then lastly, I won't dwell a lot on regulatory and standards here, but we're seeing very good progress, particularly on the vehicle side, with clarification of approaches in both the US and Europe. While they're not entirely aligned, and other industry forums you can sit on, you hear about a lot of concerns about ensuring they approach the problem in a similar way, and we end the day with a common set of regulations globally. Again, those things that really help investment scale across markets. Very good progress being made, and very appreciative of the seriousness with which we think FAA and others are really taking the market here.
Great. Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you. That was pretty comprehensive. So let me introduce Charlie. We'll do the questions and questions afterwards. Let me introduce Charlie Hipwood, who is the president and CEO of Mass Ventures. Now, that's a state investment fund. So Charlie will comment on how a state-based venture fund or venture capitalist looks at the market. So Charlie, are you ready?
Yeah.
Do you have any slides or anything?
Nope, no slides. I'm still not sure what I'm going to talk about, so I
go.
didn't have time to create anything. I think Colonel Diller said he was just a dumb Texan, and I'm just a dumb venture capitalist. So, I think, as you said, I'm with Mass Ventures. We are, for lack of a better term, the Commonwealth's venture capital team. We also run several grant programs, mostly focused on SBIR funded companies, and we've seen a lot of technologies in this space over the last several years. So it's becoming more and more interesting to look at from a VC perspective. And I think, in listening to some of the earlier panelists, it's clear that, we're doing a lot at the state level with Mass DOT, with Mass Port, the FAA, and a lot of local partners. And we certainly think about all the regulations involved in this industry, in addition to the technology that's being developed. And, quite often venture capitalists stay away from regulated industries, especially in early days, right? It's just regulation typically means slower to develop, makes that economic plan less feasible, that Andrew just talked about. But that's not to say that VCs and entrepreneurs don't attack regulated markets often. I think, one of the things we haven't discussed today at length is just the role of the entrepreneur in developing these markets and being the catalyst, right? So in a regulated market, you often see private capital come in when there's an entrepreneur who's ready to just do it, as Andrew just said in a prior panelist. We saw that in financial services when Elon Musk and others started PayPal and just said, we're going to do it. and let the regulators catch up. And I think it was acknowledged earlier that often the technology is probably way ahead of where the regulators are now. You saw it with Uber and livery services, you saw it with Airbnb and hospitality, all regulated industries where entrepreneurs just kind of said, I'm going to do it and just try to stop me. And I'm not encouraging entrepreneurs to break any regulations, especially being a state employee. But I think, most VCs are kind of, who are sniffing around this space, are looking for who's the entrepreneur who's going to really take the bull by the horns here and drive this industry forward. And that's often what it takes. And then, it's good to hear that we have a lot of agencies in the state, Mass DOT, Massport, the FAA at the federal level, who are already prepared for the inevitability of this market. But oftentimes it's that catalyst of the entrepreneur who forces people to make decisions around these markets quickly. And it's the VCs who back those entrepreneurs, and then the market develops.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you, Charlie. Okay, next we have Heather Arneson. She's the technical lead for, let me make sure the slide is up, for NASA. Oh, I jumped too far. Technical lead for NASA's Urban Air Mobility Services, and as part of NASA's Air Traffic Management X program. So that's the new program that was, I think, was released maybe 2 years ago now. So she'll discuss some of the work she's doing, and she's focused a little bit on procedural approaches towards this integrated airspace. So Heather, are you ready?
Yep, I'm here. Can you see me and hear me?
Perfect, perfect.
Okay, great. Thanks, Wasim. Yeah, so I'm working on urban air mobility and our air traffic management exploration project. Our urban air mobility sub-project is focused on passenger carrying urban air mobility. And we're focused on looking at integration of the urban air mobility traffic into the airspace. So under the sub-project, we've got a few main pieces of work that are going on. One is we're developing an airspace roadmap, and what that is really we're looking at how the UAM system is going to evolve over time as the vehicles become available, as technology matures, and as UAM demand increases. And this is basically a tool to document our assumptions so that we can all be on the same page as kind of where we're going at different stages, and we can organize our research under that. We can point to a different point on the roadmap and say, this is what I'm targeting here, and everybody knows what assumptions we're thinking about for that particular part of the roadmap. We're also working on developing concept of operations for UAM in collaboration with the FAA, other NASA projects, and the UAM community. And then we're working on research to try to enable UAM operations. That research is broken out into 4 categories. One is developing research-validated separation standards for UAM vehicles. Second is designing the airspace structure and procedures for UAM operations. And the third is developing and testing services for UAM traffic management. And we're conducting research towards defining the airspace requirements for mature UAM operations. That's a particular focus area that I'm a technical lead for. And the fourth and final area is working on building and testing the UAM architecture, which is an evolution of the UTM system. So building and testing that architecture and airspace services with industry partners, working with both vehicle and airspace partners, working on developing and preparing that core UAM airspace system for simulation and flight tests, and conducting simulations with these partners in preparation for those flight tests. So some of the barriers that we see for UAM are validating the UAM system. So in the service-oriented architecture, it's going to be difficult to ensure that services and components operate safely with one another. So we're going to have to make sure that's working well. The airspace design, we need to make sure that the airspace is able to accommodate the types and number of aircraft that we expect in mature UAM operations. and integrating that UAM traffic into the airspace. So it's going to be challenging to conduct highly automated UAM operations in close proximity to traditional operations. And then finally, managing the UAM traffic at the predicted demand levels. So we're predicting that the system is going to be operating close to full capacity. So any type of disruption could easily cause a cascading or rippling effect through the system. So that's going to be a challenge in managing the traffic in the airspace. So NASA's got several collaborations that we're working on to try to try to address some of these barriers. We've got collaborations with industry partners, other government agencies, and academia. So like I said earlier, we're working with the FAA on developing a concept of operations. We've got a few different projects going on with partners in academia. So we've got, we're working on predicting traffic demand, so trying to understand what traffic demand will be at different stages as technology advances. We're also working with academia to identify airspaces could be usable for UAM traffic. So one of the big barriers for UAM is that we don't want to burden the air traffic controllers that are working on working with traditional air traffic. So we're working with a partner in academia that is trying to identify regions of airspace at different metro locations that UAM traffic could use and would limit the probability of interaction with the traditional commercial air traffic. And then kind of starting from that, we're working on defining airspace for different metro areas that would be used for the urban air mobility traffic, and working with the FAA to kind of understand, where they would allow us to kind of carve out corridors for the urban air mobility traffic. We've worked on the Dallas-Fort Worth area a lot and have a pretty good network there, and have moved on to start looking at the Los Angeles area as well. So kind of moving around and focusing on different areas to try to understand what that airspace could look like, and then figuring out the amount of traffic that we could accommodate in there. And finally, we're working with external vehicle partners, vehicle and airspace partners for experiments and preparations for flight test.
Fantastic. Thank you, Heather. Thank you. Let me see if I can fire this. Let me see if I can fire this up. So, no, hang on, I have to share. Oh, here it is. So, okay, so thank you, Heather. So the next one is me. So I'll talk a little bit about it. I'm going to use a couple slides as backdrop, okay, to talk about what we're thinking in terms of operationalizing the vision for the UAS industry. So some of you may have seen these slides already. So just need somebody to confirm that they're up.
They are up.
Okay, thank you so much. So, so I've used this chart a little bit. So if you can see this chart, the whole notion here of types are entering the NAS. The backdrop of the chart here shows you the notion of, an airport, an aircraft traveling from one airport to another, which is really focused on intercity travel, because that's how we did things, right? So we're going 200 miles to 8,000 miles typically, right? So the reason for that backdrop is because everything we've done over the last 50, 80 years in this market has been to build infrastructure to enable safe passage of passengers and cargo in that airspace, right? So in the backdrop, you've got infrastructure such as, and we use this thing called CNS-ATM, right? So comm, navigation, surveillance, and then air traffic management automation, right? So the question is, that's what's happening in the background. Everything that we've provided already with respect to long-range radar, airport surveillance radar, things like that, other surveillance technologies, communications, weather, so even weather, and I know that we'll be talking about weather tomorrow quite a bit, but all of our weather models are based on like what's known as 2K. So you've got 2K cubes. So that's quite a large volume of airspace, but which is fine for intercity travel. But now as you move to the foreground of this picture, the foreground is now showing you intra-city or intra-region. And it's got some notions of, small UASs that are typically traveling 1 to 10 miles for like deliveries. And everyone knows the story of Amazon's delivery, logistics, etc. And then you've got this notion of these air taxis, eVTOL enabled, 50 to 200 miles. So you're really within the region. You can go from, we're in Massachusetts, so I can go from Boston to New York, right? Or I can go from Springfield to Boston, or I can go to Framingham to Boston in some sort of air taxi. So the question is, at the ground, we have all this infrastructure, and it's designed for intercity travel. How does it map into the intra-city travel? Does it scale down to that urban landscape? So that's a fundamental question. And then the other side of it is, typically this activity that we're looking at in the foreground in terms of small UASs and large eVTOL taxis or shuttles or whatever they are, it's all going to happen within what's known as the terminal volume, terminal airspace. And because that's where the activity takes place. And if you don't know, terminal airspace is the bridge between the airport and the en route. But the terminal can have something like, on average, 30 airports within it. Each airport may have 5 to 10 runways. They may have one tower, or 5 towers, whatever the number is. So it's very complex airspace. So in that terminal, you typically don't have that much traffic. And at any one point, I suppose you can max out at about 100 aircraft. But where we're going to in this new world is we're moving from 100 aircraft. Near term, it might be 500 aircraft, but then the projections are we're going to move to 5,000 or 20,000 in a region. So that's fascinating, right? So now you're moving from, so that's what's really happening. So you've got this background of aircraft that we have in that volume, and now we're going to move up to that next scale. So the two fundamental questions I have on this chart is, on the left, can the infrastructure scale down? And on the right, with the traffic volumes expected, can the infrastructure support that traffic, right? So it's fundamentally, there are some complex issues over here. So I'm going to go to the next chart. The next chart is kind of our overall, our internal vision type thing. So what are we looking at? Now, the FAA's ConOps, and you're going to get a great opportunity, and you got Heather, and you got a great opportunity to chat to Steve Bradford later on today, and you can ask the questions in terms of the current FAA ConOps, and the ConOps are to segregate airspace out a little bit. So, hey, you want access to airspace? Yes, you can have access, but you can have it over there and over there, as long as you're not close to anything else. So that's good. But where is it moving? It's going to move to this world of integrated airspace, right? So how do we integrate that airspace? What does it look like? So in the background of this graphic here, I've got the same Class B airspaces from those two airports. And at the top, you can see it's got, air routes and satellite communication and satellite navigation and weather, etc. But in the foreground, you've got that city again, right? So you've got the city, but now you've got some highways in the sky. And of course, this is kind of a crawl, walk, run analogy, right? So, the big panacea of the future is no highways, right? Everyone can go point A to point B. That'll be a long while before that happens. So what we're looking at is how to organize traffic within that airspace into certain areas. So in the foreground, you've got a city, and then you've got some highways over the city, and these highways are probably tracking the major highways on the ground, and that's where a lot of your logistic deliveries will move along. So they'll move up and down the highways, and when they have to get off on a branch road, they'll do that to get from the source to the destination. Right? We've also got some higher altitude highways for the air taxis. So that's coming through, right? So what does that mean? So you've got a number of highways that are going to connect within a region and then connect region to region. So you're going to start seeing organized traffic in that space. And the other thing that you see here is we have these urban airports. And as these urban airports, some people call them vertiports, right? But the urban airports appear, and now you need to get, and they have their own equivalent of Class B airspace, right, for those areas. So what does that look like, and how do we start mapping it out? So part of what we're working on is how to integrate all this together for a future that's further out to what's taking place today in the current ConOps. And then on the ground, there's certain types of infrastructure that you're going to need. The FAA has its architecture that has these things called USSs, UTM service suppliers, and that's kind of represented by these boxes over here. We forgot to the annotation of this chart. And the same thing applies for the eVTOLs, and you've got things like that. There are things like supplemental data services that a few people alluded to earlier today. Then there's ANSP type work. Now, the other big interesting issue here is the FAA, unlike ANSPs, air navigation service providers. So as Peter said earlier, FAA is an air navigation service provider. So it's an ATO. The FAA ATO is the ANSP. But now it operates differently to ANSPs around the world. Around the world, ANSPs are normally pseudo-privatized agencies, but they own the airspace and they own the monopoly of the airspace. So what does that mean? It means that everybody who needs access to that airspace, they have to provide it, and they are incentivized to monetize that airspace, which is not the same for the FAA in this country. Okay? It has a different way of funding. So internationally, we're seeing more and more activity now with respect to moving away from segregated and starting to think about how to integrate that airspace. So it's starting to happen now. I think in another 5 years' time, you'll see more and more concepts in this area. Okay, I think that concludes my remarks. Let me make sure I have enough time okay, so I've talked about that. Now we'll move on to some growth areas that have some lower regulatory burdens, right? So what I'll ask Billy Thalmeyer is an ex-Aurora Flight Sciences, which is a Boeing company, right? Where he's worked as an engineer, program manager, business development, on to running business development, right? So he was running business development. But now he's going to provide some overall comments into some alternative market opportunities. So Billy, do you have any slides or anything you want to show?
Hey, Wasim. Nope, no slides.
No slides, okay.
Well, plenty to talk about.
That's fine. I'm going to go back, put this up. There you go.
Great.
Billy.
Well, yeah, thanks for having me speaking, and excited to be here. Yeah, I wanted to provide some general commentary about sort of the aviation industry in general and how innovation is sort of being rewarded there versus some adjacent industries like automotive and maritime. So looking at the aviation industry specifically, we're seeing the largest efforts sort of forming around two main pillars, electrification and automation, right? And the benefits of these are sort of universally acknowledged. Electrification can make things more sustainable. It can reduce your fuel and maintenance costs compared to conventional propulsion systems. There's potential for noise reduction and automation similarly so, right? Increased safety, you can get the pilot out of the cockpit, higher reliability, higher rule following, potentially more revenue from, if you're removing pilots from small aircraft, you can get an extra passenger in there. But if we look at the traction that electrification and autonomy efforts has had to date, it's a little less impressive than, say, the benefits we may get out of them, right? And if we look at electrification certification efforts specifically, only one aircraft in the world has been certified, the Pipistrel Velis Electro, by EASA as a light sport. And that process took them 3 years. There's still no equivalent standard in the FAA. And that light sport certification that they did get is for VFR only in 2 seats, which is not necessarily a world-changing certification. Now, certainly this is the first step of many, but for manufacturers wanting to stay up to date with the latest technology as they create these new vehicles, there's even more sort of certification efforts for them as they go, because each time you have a battery or a motor or a hardware upgrade, right, there's going to be more STC process involved as you go through that. And this whole industry being so nascent on the electrification side is sort of predicated on the fact that you're going to have these continual upgrades as battery technology, battery chemistries, and the motor designs advance. So it's definitely an uphill climb to introduce some of these electrification technologies into aerospace. The same can be said about autonomy, and potentially even more so, right? There are several companies, Zipline, Volansi, Amazon Prime Air, for example, working on autonomous drone deliveries, and there are several more working on autonomous aircraft at scale, such as Reliable Robotics, X-Wing, and Aurora Flight Sciences. But all are meeting certification challenges and getting specifically towards beyond line of sight operations, which at the end of the day is a requirement for their business case in terms of deliveries and in terms of not having all these extra people on the ground watching their aircraft. BLOS really is necessary for a business case and getting beyond just demonstrations and sort of toy products. But it's interesting because the technology is mature, right? And the Predator drones have been operating beyond line of sight since the mid-90s. The hardware exists, the communications technology exists. And the argument in terms of certifying these craft today typically falls on 2 points: the communications technology and detect and avoid. Now, the communications challenge is significant. The communications channels for the aircraft often have to use frequencies in the FCC's unrestricted bands. And so it's interesting that sort of fears over bad actors taking over data channels and sending false signals can actually keep innovative projects grounded. The idea that someone could hack these aircrafts while they're in these testing phases, can be left up to interpretation, but it's often arguments like those that end up making these really innovative programs grounded for months to years in working out the safety cases. And that's even considering the fact that these vehicles in these test cases are typically designed with redundant sensors and redundant communications links. As of March of last year, the FAA has only granted approval for 6 companies to fly drones beyond line of sight. Actually, companies in North Carolina were leading the way. Several of them were down there. But there are already talks of revoking the BLOS waivers when COVID is over, because there are going to be more people on the streets and there's going to be less demand for sort of the shipping medical supplies. And it was under that context that they were allowed BVLOS in the first place. So that there's maybe even on the horizon thoughts of going backwards. So, at the end of the day, the general sort of air traffic and FAA regulatory context is not incentivized to innovate, which is really interesting when we consider that, us aerospace engineers we like to think of ourselves at least as some of the most innovative in the bunch. There's no reward structure to be the regulator that says, I'm going to allow this, and then something falls out of the sky. And therefore we see this, very regulated and very step-by-step path to innovation. Now, aviation is obviously incredibly safe, and the FAA does a tremendous job at that. And if we look at how safe exactly it is, it sort of paints an interesting picture, right? There are between 400 and 500 fatalities worldwide in commercial aviation when we consider sort of vehicles over 14 passengers. That worldwide number, 400 to 500 fatalities, is about the same as how many people get struck by lightning in America every year, to sort of put that number in context. And considering America has the 20th of the world population, you're about 20 times more likely to get struck by lightning than you are to die in a plane crash somewhere in the world. So, I mean, a system with that level of safety is clearly a marvel of the modern world, but, at what cost to innovation, right? Aircraft today look a lot like the airliners of the 1950s, and in many cases are still powered by the same fuels of the 1950s. So we can look at, where does that danger come from? The primary cause of aviation accidents is actually pilot error. 80% of commercial jet accidents are from pilot error, where only 3.5% are from mid-air collisions. And if you look specifically mid-air collisions with drones, there's only 3 since 2017. And so sort of the concern over the BVLOS control and communications, in my perspective, is a little misplaced, because there's all this sort of failure that's happening around pilot control, where things like autonomy and the redundancy promised by electric propulsion could actually benefit. And yet we're seeing the focus on this 3.5% of sort of the challenges and danger that come from mid-air collisions. Now, there are certainly steps in the right direction. There's the new Part 23 with the more generalized performance-based regulations. There's the new light sports certificate allowing electric propulsion, and the IPP and beyond programs are a great start to this. But this isn't quite enough, and the Part 23 regulations in and of itself are quite onerous. If you look at recent Part 23 craft like the Vision Jet or the Honda Jet or even the Eclipse 500, it took them all 5 to 10 years to certify, even in the Part 23 context, and they all spent on the order of $1 billion to do that. And that, context is still maintaining going forwards. If we look at the eVTOL companies right now, Lilium's raised $400 million to date. Joby's raised $800 million to date. It takes fundraisers on the order of $500 million to $1 billion to play the game that is Part 23 certification. Looking at sort of the average age of the GA fleet, it's 50 years old. That number like cries out to me that there is something wrong with the innovation in aerospace right now, that the average age of a general aviation aircraft is 50 years old. And so companies today know that if they're going through a Part 23 channel, that they're going to need to raise on the order of $1 billion. And, it's this sort of regulatory and capital hurdle that's sort of narrowing the field in terms of what development can happen there. And so it's interesting to sort of expand and say what development is happening in these adjacent industries and at what pace. In automotive, automation is really surpassing and happening at a great pace. You look at the first electric cars were already in market in the mid-90s. Tesla had the Roadster in the mid-2000s. Autonomous features have been getting into market. The Toyota Prius in 2003 had an intelligent parking system, and lane keep assist was introduced in the same year, right? Features of autonomy are getting into the hands of the customers, and the system in and of itself is not substantially more dangerous because of these new technologies. Often it's quoted that the aviation industry is far more safe than the car industry, and that is true on a per mile basis. But if you think about it on a per hour basis, in terms of how long are you sitting in the car or the plane and to what danger are you exposed to, actually going by car is about an order of magnitude safer than going by plane on a per hour basis. So clearly, I mean, there's different problems here, and I think that's accepted, right? And, as a pilot myself, I understand that when you lose power in an automobile, it's a very different scenario than when you lose power in a plane. And, my pilot education was far more intensive than my driving education. So I understand as both an engineer and an operator the added difficulty of innovating in the aviation space. But still, in automotive, regulatory bodies are helping rather than hurting. And, autonomous cars are regulated by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, who are actually leading themselves the proposal to modify the crash rules for the autonomous cars. For example, if you don't have a driver in the front seat, you're not subject to the same safety, the same deceleration crash loads. And if we look at the pace of how aviation versus automotive is advancing, over the past 20 years, right, we've gone from the first electric car and the first autonomous features to now autonomous cars almost on the road and electric cars being ubiquitous. When we go back to aviation, again, the Predator flew 24 years ago and we still don't have BLOS. And it's not just because airplanes are harder, right? If you look at the beginning of the aviation industry, the first flight was in 1903, and the Spirit of St. Louis flew across the Atlantic 24 years later. So these 2-year timelines of revolutionary change are possible in aviation, but the regulatory environment is making it hard to innovate now. Now, I also believe there's huge opportunities in maritime for the same reason. It's actually one of the opportunities that I'm personally pivoting from an aviation to a maritime focus. On a per passenger basis, traveling by boat is actually about twice as dangerous as traveling by plane. And I'll let Jacob speak to more detail soon. But again, the maritime industry is advancing and proposing and employing, getting behind the new technology to solve these problems. And the international governing body, the International Maritime Organization, is focused on bringing these new technologies to market. The first electric ferries came out in 2015 in Norway, in 2018 in the US, and now there's dozens of them all over the world. Similarly, autonomy is starting to catch on. NOAA is using autonomous boats to map the ocean floor. MIT is using autonomous boats to map the waterways in Amsterdam, and the Navy is now looking for autonomous boats in general. So, taken all together, the maritime and automotive industries are really forward-facing and accepting of aerospace, and they're trying to get these new technologies into the hands of the customer. And they're taking calculated, pragmatic levels of risk, not overly risking, and clearly they're not exposing themselves to over risk because the market response is so positive to these things. And if the risks they were taking were too drastic, we wouldn't want to get in our cars anymore, or we wouldn't want to walk along the side of a road anymore. So clearly the risks they're taking are calculated and are still safe, but they're getting electrification and autonomous technologies into the hand of the customer. And I think with the transportation industry as a whole struggling under the weight of COVID, I think we're going to see more talent and technology actually start to move out of aerospace potentially and into automotive and even more into maritime as this burgeoning space to follow that customer demand and really feed the customer with electrification and autonomy in a less regulatory risky environment. So I think in general, it's an important lesson for the aviation industry, and there's some huge opportunities in automotive and maritime that I think Jacob can talk about.
Thank you, Billy. So, you know, my head rattled so many times. So many times I want to ask a question, but I'm going to wait. I will wait. So thank you, Billy. Let me move on to Jacob. So Jacob Rutenbeek is, he's been around the block, ex-Thales, ex-Raytheon, and now AMAP. And he's recently started his own venture, leveraging some airspace concepts into an adjacent domain. So Jacob, if you're ready.
I'm ready. Can you hear me?
Absolutely. Have you got any slides to share?
Great. Yeah, I have one slide I'll put up. I think it helps communicate some of the challenges here. So let me share that. Okay, great. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Awesome. I think what I'll do is simply piggyback off of what Billy said. So thanks for the introduction, Wasim, and laying the groundwork for this, Billy. It's an exciting environment in maritime, and fundamentally, I think the opposite of what we're finding in aviation. Well, we can go through a list of the comparisons. Something that most people don't know is that seafaring is the deadliest job in the world. So when you start with the paradigm of safety in aviation, you find the exact opposite in maritime. Looking back over the past 10 years, 1,000 ships have been lost, 950 exactly. And these are just the total losses. These aren't the partial losses or the casualties who didn't die or the ships that could still be used after dramatic repair and an expensive bill at that. And along the lines of this, there's been 2,500 deaths. I read the news, I keep up with the trade press as we all do. And every week there is another incident that happens. There's on average, that's 2 ships that get lost every week and 5 seafarers who die. And so you think that it's a huge problem. It affects thousands of lives. And we're not just making aviation safer. For example, when we look at the aviation context, we're actually taking a fairly unsafe mode of transportation as it stands today and dramatically increasing the safety. So we start there in the maritime context. When you look at the root causes of a lot of these major maritime disasters, and obviously some are here on the screen that you may be familiar with, you get to the similar issues as you do in the aviation context. A majority of disasters at sea are due to human error. And when they get down to it, one of the primary drivers of this is that we still navigate with our eyes and ears. Fundamentally, ship navigation hasn't changed in over 50,000 years. The first sailors to set sail used their eyes and ears, right? They'd look for the rocks, they'd look for the tide, they'd look for the water movement. The bridge of $1 billion cargo ship today looks a whole lot like, the Mayflower from 400 years ago. Why is that? Why haven't we done more? Maritime's really, in this context, the ultimate legacy industry, just waiting to be, disrupted and innovated. I'll go through some of the disasters here on the screen, just because they resonated with me, and that's why they're here. I grew up cruising a lot. Actually, my story begins when I was a kid. My dad was a marine electrician in the Dutch Navy, and then he came over to the US, and I was like 4 or 5 at the time. He was working at Broward Marine as a marine electrician. I remember sitting along the side and staring at the yachts he was working on and thinking, I want to work with the water one day. And, finally I have that opportunity to bring some of this innovative technology to that space. But I grew up cruising as we were, all through high school. A kid in South Florida, Port Everglades is right there. And the Costa Concordia, I remember like reading this on the news. I think it was fairly real time at the time, and hearing about this cruise ship that hit a rock. And I think everybody thought, like myself, I'm assuming here, that we all thought it was an uncharted rock, that the ship just happened to find something in the water that wasn't there. Well, it turns out it wasn't just, an uncharted rock. It was well documented on the charts, and it was visible. It's actually like an island sticking out of the water. And you have to ask yourself, how did the ship, the captain, manage to turn off and manually disable all safety systems and physically steer this ship into a rock, leading to 32 people dead and over a $2 billion loss? And then I remember back in 2015, the most recent major disaster in U.S. maritime history was the El Faro. 33 people dead. And in that case, it was a U.S. Merchant ship, a U.S. cargo ship, a pretty modern one too, that sailed into the eye of a Category 4 Hurricane Joaquin. And I remember reading the news and thinking, how does a modern ship just sail into the eye of a hurricane? Well, it turns out the problem was even fundamentally worse. The captain didn't know he was sailing into a hurricane. Because of the outdated processes for weather, which would come over to his personal email shipboard, and then he'd have to forward them to the bridge, and then open them up and try to interpret what it was telling him. We didn't have weather exchange, ship-to-ship weather exchange, and weather reporting at the time, and we still don't today for the vast majority of ships. So that collaborative weather sharing isn't there. On top of that, you'll just look at the weather problem, and you can get to the fact that the captain had weather that was 18 hours old, and there was no check on that process to ensure from shoreside staff who didn't know that the captain was relying on outdated weather, that process was fundamentally broken, and it's still broken today. When you look at the John McCain or even the Fitzgerald, these are two U.S. Navy ships that, due to the voyage management system complexity and problems in training and really understanding the user interface, these ships collided with other commercial ship traffic. And then finally, I put this one on here because it was so recent, the Wakashio, which was a ship that ran aground, causing a massive oil spill, when $65 million of cleanup costs, and you can see it split its back as it beached itself on the sandbar right there in a marine sanctuary. All not because they didn't know it was there, but because they didn't understand how to properly navigate the ship. So fundamentally, we have decision aids there. We have tools to help navigators make better decisions, but we still rely on people to consume massive amounts of data and really steer these ships safely. And the problem just breaks down. So what I wanted to focus on today is and that's really it, is to just highlight the problems in adjacent environments, especially environments that are suffering from problems today that can benefit from a lot of the solutions developed in the aviation space today. And that's what we're doing here with SailPlan and the intelligent navigation system that we've built.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you. Okay, I think it's time for questions. And I suppose I'll open up with something for Charlie. We don't have tons of time. So Charlie, Silicon Valley is moving at high speed. Right? We always hear about Silicon Valley investors. Do you believe that they understand the complexities of airspace access?
Simple answer to that, I do. I think the complexities are somewhat obvious. I just think it's a cultural thing. I touched a little bit on it before about, having the entrepreneurial mindset of just attacking markets, no matter the outcome, breaking things along the way, doing what it takes to build a business. And that's a little bit different from the culture here in Massachusetts, where, we certainly focus on the regulations and other things. So I think I think they understand the complexities for sure. I don't know, again, what it's going to take for the right entrepreneur to really develop these industries. But I still firmly believe that the technology's there, the regulators are ready, but it's really the real catalyst here is going to be an entrepreneur who really takes the bull by the horns. And that's what you see often in Silicon Valley.
Thank you. Let me see if I can find something. Before I look at that, let me ask another one off. We got a Heather. So Heather, all this work you were doing, right? How far do you think procedural updates will help facilitate UAM or AIM access to the NAS?
I think combination of procedural updates and setting aside airspace for UAM traffic is really going to be what we need to achieve the expected demand. So we're working on both of those. I think, you know, making sure that we're able to not have to rely on ATC for separation, not have to bother them, kind of be on our own in our own airspace, and making sure we're managing ourselves is going to go a long way. I think we're going to have some new, maybe kind of a new type of flight rule for urban air mobility traffic, something that allows for tighter separation requirements that we can achieve with the automation that we're expecting to have on these vehicles and the ground systems. So I think a combination of all of that is really going to get us to where we need to be to accommodate the expected demand.
Fantastic. So feel free to put your questions down in the chat. So let me see. I've got a question here. Is this a ground-based infrastructure problem or a vehicle-to-vehicle coordination problem or a combination of both or both thereof? This is with respect to infrastructure to accommodate dense traffic operations. Does anybody want to take that, or is that going to be at my end? All right, I can take a crack. So that's from Greg. So I think, you know, with respect to infrastructure, there's the panacea says, hey, we can do everything on board the aircraft, right? And that's kind of an approach. The other approach is, hey, you need to have some ground truth on the ground, right? So you need to know what's going on. So there's a number of different technologies, right? On the ground, we need to know who's up there and why. And part of who's up there can be done collaboratively, where the aircraft is pinging its ID, but that doesn't mean you're going to get everybody who's out there. You need to know what that airspace looks like. So there's always going to be a need for the ground to have primary radar paints, whatever you want to call them. And the same applies for things like, as you start thinking about dense traffic, now you're going to have to start scaling. And once you're scaling, and the current term is trajectory-based operations, which is really looking at, okay, as an aircraft has to have a four-dimensional trajectory and it's moving on to performance, but right now it's trajectories. Once you have that, you know where the aircraft is, you know where it's going, you know where it's going to be on a given timeline, but you now have to sequence that with every other aircraft that's out there. So how do you do that, right? So how much of that is distributed, and at what point do you need something that oversees that? So I don't know if that helps, Greg.
Hey, Wasim, I might just add to that as well,
Sure.
From sort of the ground radar perspective. I think there's a big data issue that goes along with it as well. We're seeing some companies now looking to interact with the existing ground radar networks that, say, air traffic control uses. And in some cases, like when there's partnerships, especially when there's military partnerships that exist, that data is being made accessible through various software packages or various sort of monitors for the companies who are trying to use the autonomous aircraft to make use of. But in other cases, the air traffic control radar networks are being deemed to contain almost too much information. And in that case, it's almost a double standard that, hey, you guys need to see all the traffic, detect and avoid everything. But if you can detect and avoid everything too good, maybe that's a safety hazard and we don't want you to use that. And so I think, as we go towards looking at these ground situational awareness networks, that's a problem where, we're going to need to align on a definition of having, the right amount of data, and everyone's going to need to buy into that definition.
I think that's a fair comment, but that goes back to one of your comments earlier when you were delivering your comments, Billy, which is the risk-reward ratio that came to mind. You talk about, a number of people dying in cars and on boats and whatever, and an aircraft. But the big issue with an aircraft, of course, is it's, especially the commercial airliners, there are so many souls on board, right? So it has a different impact. So there may be more, accidents I'll use that word, on the ground, but the impact is not as large, right? Typically, right? So there's that to be thought of too. Let's see, I've got another question for Jacob, right? With an example like Concordia, how do you fix a situation involving almost total human error? It seems like captains or pilots are able to bypass fail-safes. This is always going to be a problem.
Yeah, it is a problem. I think what we need is better validation of what's happening ship side in real time. See, what happens in commercial fleets is that there's a ship manager and typically a shore or emergency operations command center that's monitoring the fleet's movements. Unfortunately, they just don't have really good data. So if you can imagine a few things with Costa Concordia or even Alfaro, that in real time, they had a picture that the voyage plan was changed and that the ship now was on course or coming too close to a geofenced, rock, that could trigger an escalated alarm shoreside. And that's something that we do that's not presently done today. The second thing there is that that you need. I'm sorry, I lost track of my head as I was thinking aloud. You need that ultimate, really a digital twin of what's happening on the ship, real time shoreside. Shoreside doesn't see that today. What they really see is a 3 to 8 minute old picture of where the ship is. And the majority of decision making is purely left in the hands of the captain. That's just because of tradition and the lack of comms at sea, right? That's the way the system has developed over time. But with high bandwidth SATCOM now being increasingly available, that's no longer the answer going forward. And I think that's how you stop these issues from happening in the first place.
Fantastic. Okay, let me go back to Andrew. So as an institutional investor, Andrew, right? How do you think about the market development and return on investment here? I mean, your job is to work out, hey, shall I put my big bucks on this chip or on that? Where do I put my chips?
Yeah, that's a great question because it's an entire new kind of ecosystem, a really whole new value chain being developed. And if you're Collins, and now certainly as part of the larger Raytheon, we could really put our chips anywhere in this space, right? If we believe, there are lots of opportunities. So trying to kind of really think about which bet makes sense to make now versus in the future, right? And if we're in a period where really, I'll focus on the larger passenger carrying eVTOLs because it's a little closer to home to a lot of what we do. But if you think about investing in distributed electric propulsion in those areas, those are the problems being solved first, and you'll kind of get a sense of, if you believe ultimately in the long run market, you may feel you need to be an early mover there. Whereas in some of the autonomous systems that are really needed at that later stage where we think we're going to get the market to scale, perhaps you can, while continuing to do your internal R&T and advanced technology investments, when do you kind of move forward with a product implementation? Because you don't want to be necessarily too far ahead of market in something like that. So that's the calculus of these really long cycle markets, I think, to get to the ROI. That you actually need. I think another factor in particular for a company like Raytheon or Collins is, obviously the disruptive potential of technologies out of this segment into the rest of our markets, and looking at how we manage that or respond to that opportunity or threat, depending on what side of the coin you sit on, are all of those complicated sort of things we try to work through internally in sort of prioritizing that investment. I'll say it's been, as Wasim, from conversations we've had, what COVID's done in our traditional aviation sector has made that an even harder discussion to have here the last 6 months, and certainly looking for the next year. So it's not gotten to be an easier decision by any means.
Thank you. Let me pull some questions that were out there. So Ralph asked, are drone companies including weather sensors in their aircraft to determine, visual flight rules? So maybe that's a Billy one or an Andrew one.
Sorry, Wasim, can you say, I only heard the second part of that, determining visual flight rules.
Are drone companies including weather sensors in their aircraft to determine VFR? It's almost like, what are they called? I've forgotten what they're called. the air winds aloft type data? Right? Are we pulling that data in? I don't know if that's correct, Ralph.
Yeah, I think, from my experience, onboard weather radar is certainly part of the designs of these things in terms of trying to avoid clouds. I think the bigger problem is figuring out reliable ways of identifying aircraft. And I think the basis for the operations of autonomous aircraft is assuming you're going to do mostly VFR operations anyways, because right now the detection part of detect and avoid has to be visual. We can't rely on ADS-B because not everyone is carrying ADS-B in the air. And so we need to use visual sensors and machine learning to identify these targets. So while there may be sort of weather radar on board these, I think it's more of a weather planning only launched during VFR and then identify visually, at least in the first few years of autonomous airplane flying.
I'd agree with that. And I think the added challenge in the need for some of these sensors to be multifunction, right, and handle both traffic and weather with the same aperture, some of the same processing systems as well, which is just because of the size weight of the aircraft, they don't have the budget to put on a lot of bespoke sensors, and so that's an added challenge here, because those are some different challenges, obviously, as you mentioned.
So, Wasim, if I could clarify real quick.
Sure.
So, what I want to get, what all of you have said here is, there is concern and policy on the FAA, changes in technology, and we're still doing business like we did a long time ago. Right now, the key is in a manned aircraft, you have a pilot who determines VFR with his eyeballs. In unmanned aircraft systems, that pilot is gone. And what the FAA is expecting is, how do we know that we're maintaining VFR? Okay, so as a weather guy, I'm working on that problem set, but radar does not give you VFR. And so if an unmanned system had some sort of sensor on it or a camera that we could determine VFR with, that would go a long ways to the FAA accepting that UASs are getting adequate weather support to make sure that we're flying in VFR conditions. That's why I brought that up.
No, thanks for that clarification, Ralph. And just for the group here, Ralph will be talking tomorrow at the session 3 and at the Pitch Fest, right? So you'll hear a lot more about some novel weather applications. But thank you for that. So you're looking for VFR. How do you evaluate VFR adequacy? But also it changes based on if it's not. It also changes based on if there's anybody on board or not, right? So that takes us down another passage. Okay, thank you. So maybe Heather, if you're still on, in terms of some of the procedural work, so there's been some studies that were cited, especially the work that was done in Sao Paulo with all the helicopters that were being used to simulate UAM services. Do you think that that approach, especially as some of these UAM operators have decided to use helicopters to start, do you think that's an adequate approach moving forward?
Using the helicopter, like the helicopter vehicles, or the rules that go on with helicopter operations, or both?
Yeah, they were using helicopters as pseudo advanced air mobility vehicles, right? Just to see what it looked like. And they tried to use it from a procedural perspective and said, okay, how many aircraft can we get in the sky? And bottom line, in Sao Paulo, they found out that, in fact, Airbus did this exercise. They had 200 helicopters, and the maximum number of operations per day was like 1,200, right? So 6 aircraft in the sky at any one time. So that was a procedural approach. So yeah, I just thought, do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, so we've done some experiments at NASA where we were looking at using simulation experiments where we were looking at using helicopter routes in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We kind of did a mix. I think we were using models that were more UAM type vehicles rather than helicopter vehicles, but using helicopter routes and those procedures. And I think what happens is, those helicopter routes aren't necessarily available at all times, and the rules and procedures on them, I think, limits the capacity. That there's also interaction that you would still need to have with the air traffic control if you're on those routes. The study that was done at NASA was really looking at the human in the loop, so focusing on what's the interaction between these UAM operations and the air traffic controller. And clearly, when it was just the nominal helicopter rules that the helicopters would have to adhere to, we couldn't meet the demand at all. So they added a letter of agreement where it would be an easier kind of communication between the operator of the UAM and the air traffic controller to say, I'm going to be in this area. Is it okay? Are you gonna allow me in? So that improves things, but it still doesn't really kind of get you to where you need to be to accommodate the demand. I think these early operations that are using helicopters to fly UAM missions are useful in a lot of other ways. I think it's giving those operators from industry a chance to interact with the FAA, to learn how to operate vehicles in the airspace, to better understand those rules, understand kind of what they're up against with the FAA and the procedures and the guidelines that are already in place. So I think they're learning a lot about that, and they're learning about their own passenger demand and understanding kind of the connection between maybe their airspace services and their ground services and ground infrastructure. So I think there's a lot to learn using those helicopter operations, but it's not going to get us to where we need to be to accommodate the demand that we're predicting.
Thank you, Heather. Let me see. How about one for Charlie? So Charlie, from Massachusetts, right? From a state perspective, what should Massachusetts do to stimulate the industry?
Yeah,
and from your perspective, how does Massachusetts differ from other states?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And, I think we heard from a lot of representatives of the state earlier about really trying to coordinate on regulation and other things. One thing that could be interesting is, if Massachusetts in particular is going to be focused on the risk side of things, maybe there's some stimulation that can be done around funding early stage companies that are really focused on mitigating the risks and providing better tools for, traffic management and other areas that we discussed earlier. And, that can be in the form of, competitions or other grant programs and things like that to really accelerate the growth on that end of the business. We already have a lot of people on the product side, a lot of smart engineers and others in the Commonwealth who are working on that side. But maybe if you really want to advance the industry, you really focus on how do we accelerate the regulators.
And who are the regulators?
Yeah.
And I think Rudy's panel discussed and looked at some of that earlier. All right, we're almost at the end. I suppose we got time for one quick question before I ask one. Let me just see if anybody else had one. Okay, so there's a question here from Dave. How close or how far for full integration of UAM and ground transportation are we? Such as an example, the future of self-driving cars. So full integration of UAM and ground. So is that multimodal? So that's a multimodal type question. Heather, do you want to try and take that?
Man, no, I don't really have a good perspective on that. I know we've got some work going on with an external partner that's looking at the multimodal problem. We're not, too far down the road on thinking about that. So I don't think I have a good response to that one.
Okay.
Well, Steve, I mean, I might chime in just a little bit there, and that certainly is I think one of the reasons you see automotive interested in this space is not just because of their manufacturing scale or some of the adjacent technologies, but because of, at least among some of them, the role they see themselves playing in the overall transportation ecosystem and kind of connecting that, enabling that overall smart city environment between ground and air and rail and transport, other things that kind of move stuff around a metropolitan environment. I think one of the challenges gets back to some of these early stages and being really thoughtful as you think about a plan for a particular ecosystem, and not just where you put the air route for avoiding obstacles and people and risk from an airspace standpoint, but then where that vertiport comes and there's studies done to make sure you're not sort of inadvertently creating a lot of congestion on the ground, right? That wasn't there previously, right? That you thoughtfully that the ground infrastructure, whether it's subways or on-demand vehicle, on-demand car arrival and departure lanes or whatever that might be, all exist and are thought about before you start dropping off 100 people an hour who still need to get somewhere.
No, thank you, Andrew. I know we're out of time, but Fiat Chrysler made that announcement this week.
Mm-hmm.
And then Hyundai with LA, etc. So I agree with you. So
yeah, GM
they're looking at it from a multimodal perspective, not just making the aircraft, which is kind of interesting. Okay, but I'm going to have to say we've run out of time, so we'll have to close this session. So thank you very much, panel. That was fascinating, right? I think we now have a commercial break, so we can get a few minutes for a brief break, and we'll see you in 15 minutes for some comments from Steve Bradford.